Let's talk about the pituitary hormones and their regulation, because regulation of these hormones is very, very important. So let's start with these. Now, the hypothalamic control of the pituitary hormones and the pituitary control in itself are the two main regulatory processes through which the pituitary gland regulates the release of its hormones. Now, the first one being the hypothalamus. Now, hypothalamus has huge amount of both nuclei, which are the collections of the cell bodies of the neuronal cells, and they have both direct effect on the posterior pituitary and an indirect effect on the anterior pituitary. By direct effect, I mean they're both synthesized and release and store uh, the hormones of the posterior pituitary. Only they are released in the vascular bed of the posterior pituitary, which is then released into the system. And by indirect effect, I mean on the anterior pituitary. That is, they only affect the anterior pituitary by the release of certain hormones known as the releasing factors and inhibiting factors. And by this, they affect the release or the production of the hormones or the 5 peptides of the anterior pituitary. Now, this is the artery through which the blood flows in, and this is the vein through which the blood flows out. So, as for the anterior pituitary, the all the hormones which are produced by the cells of the anterior pituitary, they come in contact with this plexus through the holes in the plexus known as sinusoids, and they are collected and moved together into the systemic circulation. Now, these sinuses are the one which are responsible for the collection of the hormones which are released by the anterior pituitary. This is the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal vessels. Now, these vessels are the one which are responsible for both the primary plexus and the secondary plexus, because the secondary plexus cannot form without first forming the primary plexus, because you cannot directly form a plexus composed of venous elements. You first have to form a plexus which is formed of the arterial elements, and then a plexus of the venous origin can be formed. So a primary is formed here and a secondary one is formed here. So this is the primary plexus. Now let's talk about the hypothalamic hormones and how they're regulated. Now, like I said, hypothalamus is the master or the controlling body which controls even the master gland. Now, how does it do it? It does it by one, releasing the hormones which increase the amount of the production of said hormone, or releasing inhibitory hormones which then lower or turn off the cells which secrete those cells. Now, by the release of these two releasing or inhibitory hormones by the hypothalamus, hypothalamus can further dictate the anterior pituitary that which hormone to produce in large quantities and which hormone to produce in less quantities and which hormone not to produce altogether. So all of this is done via these two releasing inhibitory hormones, and the effect is then displayed or affected on the systemic organs, which are the targets of the 5 peptides which are formed in the anterior pituitary. Now let's talk about this simple effect of both the releasing hormones and inhibitory hormones in a greater effect. Now this is a diagram of both the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. Now, what happens is that hypothalamus produces certain releasing or inhibitory hormones. Now, these hormones being both the corticotropin releasing hormone, which affects the release of the ACTH, the thyrotropin releasing hormone, which affects the release of the TSH, the GnRH or the gonadotropin releasing hormone, or the GnIH or the gonadotropin inhibiting hormone. Now, both of these hormones have an effect on both FSH and LH, that the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone. If this releasing factor is released, more of FSH and LH is produced. If this one is released, then FSH and LH production is lowered. Next, we have the prolactin releasing peptide, which increases the production of prolactin, and we have the prolactin inhibiting factor, which might be dopamine, because dopamine also inhibits the production of prolactin. Now, if this one is released, there's more prolactin. If this one is released, there's less amount of prolactin in the system. Next is the somatocrinin, which increases the amount of the growth hormone, and the somatostatin, which inhibits the amount of the growth hormone released by the anterior pituitary. So all of these hormones are basically releasing and inhibiting factors which affect the cells, which then further synthesize the said hormones of the anterior pituitary. Now, these hormones being now CRH directly affects the ACTH or the adrenocorticotropic hormone, which then affects the adrenal gland. TRH affects the TSH or the thyroid stimulating hormone. The GnRH or the GnIH affects both the luteinizing and the follicle stimulating hormone, while the prolactin releasing peptide and the prolactin inhibiting factor affect the release of the prolactin, while the somatocrinin and somatostatin, both of these affect the amount of the growth hormone present in the system. Now, like I said before, ACTH, now these are the hormones which are released by the anterior pituitary. These are the hormones which are released by the hypothalamus. Now, these are the main hormones because they are the ones which are released in the systemic circulation, while these hormones, the hypothalamic one, are only released locally and only has an effect that is local, that they are released from the hypothalamus and affect the anterior pituitary. They do not have any kind of a systemic effect. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it is only a revision. The main target of ACTH is the adrenal gland or the suprarenal gland. The main target of TSH is the thyroid gland, which is found anterior to the neck. The main target of LH and FSH is both the testes in males and ovaries in females, while the main target of prolactin is the mammary glands in females, while the effect of the growth hormone is widespread in the whole body. It affects both prenatally and postnatally. Before birth, it affects the growth of all the viscera and the organs and the bones. During the childhood, it affects the growth of the bones and the growth of the various organs, while in adulthood, it maintains their growth and their continued function. Now, how all of these glands have certain secretions, and whenever there is some kind of factor which affects them, these secretions are inhibited. Now, we will discuss all of these secretions when we will study them in detail in another lecture, but only to mention them. The corticoids or the corticosteroids are released by the adrenal glands. The thyroid hormones are released by the thyroid gland. The testosterones or the androgens are released by the testes, while the estrogens and the progesterones are released by the ovaries. Now, mammary gland and the bones have the do not have any kind of secretion. They are only affected by the main hormones being released by the anterior pituitary. So this was the lecture which was on the pituitary gland. We learned that pituitary gland's anatomy. We learned where it lies on this sphenoid bone. We learned what is the sella diaphragma, which protects the pituitary gland. We've learned about the depression in the sphenoid gland, where it resides. We learned about the infundibulum, how it connects with the hypothalamus, and we learned what is the effect of the hypothalamus on the pituitary gland. We learned that pituitary gland has both the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe, while sometimes there's even a median lobe, which is often described in textbooks. Then we learned about both the secretions of the anterior pituitary in detail, that is being the TSH, ACTH, LH, FSH, growth hormone, and the secretions of the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, which is not a secretion of its own, which is actually released by the hypothalamus, but is released in the posterior pituitary through the sinusoids into the vascular bed and then out to the hypophyseal vein into the systemic circulation. The hormones of the posterior pituitary being the oxytocin, which affects the muscles of the uterus, and the ATH, which is the anti-diuretic hormone, that it affects against the phenomena of the diuresis. So you can find this lecture among thousands of other lectures on sqadia.com, from lectures ranging on the topics such as biochemistry to physiology to anatomy to the courses in rheumatology, radiology, in medicine, even case-based and scenario-based lectures. You can find all those on sqadia.com. You can even download the app both on the Google Play Store and on the Apple App Store. You can even start your 2-day free trial in order to see all of those lectures and decide on your own that if you want to continue with the trial. We do hope that you like the website. So thank you again for watching sqadia.com.